I'm just wondering if you could expand on your definition of terrorism, whether the Ottawa shooting meets it, and why Canadians shouldn't be surprised to find themselves targets.
There really is no definition of the word terrorism, which is the problem. There's actually some great scholarship that has been done by Remy Berlin, who's at NYU and was previously at the Sorbonne, about the history of that term. And in modern usage, the term was really created by the Israelis in the late 1960s and early 1970s as a means of trying to universalize the conflicts that they were having with their neighbors, so that they could tell the world what we are fighting is not land disputes or specific conflicts to Israelis, but we're fighting this international menace called terrorism. And there were all these conferences back in that era to try and come up with a definition of the term, and the problem that both the US and the Israeli governments were having when they tried to create a definition of what terrorism meant was that it was almost impossible for them to create a definition that included the violence that they wanted to delegitimize without also including the violence that they regularly were engaging in or that they were supporting. And this has been the problem from the very beginning. It's a term that almost has no meaning of any kind, and so it's become nothing more than just a propagandistic weapon to end rational debate, to increase fear levels and the like. But whatever else terrorism means, to the extent there's a common understanding of what that term is, I think most people would say that it has to include the deliberate targeting of civilians with violence for political ends. And what struck me so kind of instantly about the Harper government's eagerness to label the Quebec incident a terrorist attack was that, according to their own series of events, the driver of the car waited in the car 2 hours until he saw soldiers in uniform, which is another way of saying that he purposely avoided violence aimed at civilians and targeted soldiers as part of a military that currently are deployed in a war. Just 2 weeks ago, the Harper government announced that the Canadian military was participating in a new war in the bombing campaign in Iraq. So whatever you think about that attack, and I think all decent people realize that it's hideous and heinous, there's almost no conceivable way that that term terrorism could be applied to it. The Ottawa attack, I think, is a bit more amorphous in terms of the motive, which is completely unclear whether this was mental instability or something else or some combination of things. But I think the important point to think about is that if you want to be a person who uses the term terrorism or who is affected when political leaders use it, it's first really important to have an understanding of what that means, and then to also ask yourself whether your own government's actions qualify by the meaning that you've ascribed to the term.
Great, thanks. Ricochet published an editorial this morning arguing that the additional powers granted to security agencies over the past decade and change have failed to make us safer. Would you agree with that assessment of these expanded powers we've seen since 9/11? And are you concerned about the application of the shock doctrine in the wake of these attacks to pass new laws which further infringe upon our charter rights? I guess I should ask, should Canadians be concerned about the use of these attacks to pass new laws that further infringe upon our rights?
I think all Westerners should be concerned. In fact, I think people around the world should be concerned because you have two sets of victims. One is the people who live in Western democracies, where over and over, it's not just in Canada, the same pattern has been seen obviously in the US and the UK. Just recently, Australia used this scary specter of ISIS in order to justify incredibly radical legislation that criminalized all kinds of journalism. But then people around the world who aren't living in Western democracies tend to be the other victims as well. And so I think the world has a serious interest in how Western governments, with their massive militaries that they deploy quite easily and readily, are responding to the threat that they call terrorism. As far as the question about the efficacy, we have seen terrorist attack after terrorist attack after terrorist attack either be successfully carried out, like the ones this week in Canada or the one on the Boston Marathon, or attacks that were thwarted not by these new security measures but by citizens being aware, like the attempted detonation of bombs in Times Square, or the attempted explosion of an airplane over Detroit on Christmas Day. And I think the crucial point here is that these policies not only don't work to stop attacks like that, they actually make the detection of terror plots more difficult, because if you're engaged in mass surveillance as opposed to targeted surveillance, where you're indiscriminately collecting data about entire populations without regard to whether they've done anything wrong. You're essentially drowning yourself in information, and you make it impossible to find the things that you claim these systems are intended to detect.
Fascinating. Now, of course, for a Canadian audience, one of the things that we're very interested in is the role of the Communications Security Establishment Canada, CSEC. And in your new book, you write that Canada spies for the NSA and covers it up by lying to us. Can you give a little summary of what you found out from the Snowden papers and your own research about our government's surveillance activities?
There really almost is no way to talk about Canada's surveillance activities as though it's its own separate and distinct category, because Canada does almost all of its surveillance through the Five Eyes Alliance. And what's really striking about the Five Eyes Alliance, the members of which are the US, UK, Australia, New Zealand, and Canada, is that it is this kind of indivisible alliance. Typically with military alliances or diplomatic alliances, different members will have different aspirations or different limits on what they're willing to do, so they kind of come together on certain common ground but go their separate ways on others. They divide up what they're willing to do and not willing to do. The Five Eyes is indivisible. They share almost every single thing with one another. And in part, that's because there is no such thing as the Canadian or the Australian or the British internet. The internet is one enormous apparatus that we all share. And so you can't segregate what countries are doing or what partnerships are doing in terms of surveillance. So all the reporting that we've been able to do over the last year and a half about the MSA or the GCHQ essentially involves CSEC and the Canadian government as well. You know, the first report that I ever did on Canada as part of the Snowden archive was a story that we actually did in Brazil that disclosed that CSEC was spying on the British Ministry of Mines and Energy, which just oh so coincidentally happens to be the agency of greatest interest to the Canadian timber and logging industry. And that had a lot of resonance here in Canada, in part because it was an instance of engaging in spying for unfair economic competition against a democratically elected and friendly government, and also because a lot of Canadians didn't even know that CSEC existed, or at least that it had the capabilities that these documents revealed that it had. So, you know, I think it's important to understand that CSEC is central to all of the reporting that we've been able to do based on the Snowden archive, and the system of mass surveillance that has been constructed for the internet is one that has Canada at the center of it.
So any sense of security Canadians feel about not being in the US with the NSA is false?
Just technologically speaking, if you are collecting data from the internet indiscriminately, billions of communication events each day, as the Five Eyes are doing, it is physically impossible to exclude Canadian communications. The internet is not constructed that way. So any dragnet placed over the internet will inevitably entail the collection of massive amounts of the communications of Canadians. Now, you can pass laws and policies, and these countries have, to try and limit what these governments can do about how they monitor and surveil and analyze the data from specific countries. But the collection itself covers every human being who uses the internet.
Sure. And so just to follow up then, what do you make of CSEC's repeated denials that they spy on Canadians? In contrast to what you've reported on, they just keep going, no, that's not us, we're not involved in this at all.
Western governments have become so accustomed to lying to their citizenry for many decades, but in particular after the 9/11 attack, and in part they've been able to get away with it because they do most of what's most consequential behind a wall of secrecy. And they've, at the same time, criminalized the dissemination of information about what it is they're doing that they're hiding. So they're very confident in their ability to essentially propagandize the citizenry by releasing only that information that they want people to know, and hiding everything else. And so even in the face of documents that show CSEC surveillance indiscriminately on Canadians, such as the report we did with the CBC about tracking people when they land at international airports, using hotel or cyber cafes and the like, literally just tracking people with no suspicion, CSEC continues to deny what the documents leave no doubt they're actually doing, and that kind of brazen dishonesty is possible because they've gotten away with it for so long.
You've said many times that there's more to come when it comes to the Snowden documents. Can we expect more revelations about CSEC, CSIS, or Canada more generally? And if so, what's the timeline for them?
Yeah, definitely. There's more stories to come about Canada specifically. I mean, one of the challenges with this archive is that its vastness makes it difficult sometimes to do the reporting, as does the complexity of the material. We also have obligations to essentially every country in the world to do reporting. And so sometimes it doesn't go as quickly as we would like. You also have to make sure that what you're reporting is accurate, because any mistakes that you make will be used instantly by these governments to discredit the entire project. So, we're working with the CBC, we're working with other Canadian journalists doing a lot of this reporting, and yeah, there's definitely going to be more reporting to come. I hesitate to pronounce some timeline, because when I do that, the journalists and editors with whom I'm working want to kill me, because it puts great pressure on them if I say, oh, it's coming 3 weeks from now, and then 3 weeks come and everyone starts saying, where is it? So I've learned that lesson not to do that, but we're working on it as fast as we can.
Fair enough. Following the rush of attention that met the Snowden revelations, the world seems to be moving on. And I seem to remember Snowden saying at one point that his greatest fear was that after all he went through to reveal these surveillance programs, that no one would care. Today, giants like Facebook and Google appear to be continuing their operations relatively unaffected, while a new industry is also emerging, offering privacy-aware programs, devices, and apps that seek to profit on people's discontent by offering a less evil choice. Are you concerned that our outrage will be co-opted into cosmetic changes rather than the type of significant change that you and Snowden argue is necessary?
I'm concerned about that, but I totally disagree with the premise of your question with regard to the tech companies and their posture. Right now, for example, there is a major controversy in the United States because Apple, as part of their latest iPhone, and Google, with respect to some of its newest products, have embedded into the product some extremely sophisticated encryption that they themselves have, by design, made it so that not even they can access it if the government comes to them with a warrant. In other words, there's no backdoor for governments or for these tech companies to enter. And the US government is apoplectic about it, insisting that this will let terrorists and pedophiles and murderers and rapists engage in crime and communicate without detection. And the reason those companies are doing that is not because they suddenly discovered the virtues of privacy or feel a duty to protect people's communications. It's because they are literally petrified that the revelations that we've been able to make will destroy their future business prospects if people around the world perceive that they are collaborators in a surveillance scheme. Because Facebook and Google and Yahoo know that Brazilian and Korean and German companies will be able to tell the next generation of users, don't use those companies because they'll give your data to the US government, use us instead because we'll protect your privacy. And they are now using their technological power, but also their political clout to try and restrict spying, not because they care at all about privacy, they don't, they've proven that, but because they care about their profit. The other incredibly important pressure point is that people around the world now understand the extent to which their privacy is being compromised, and they also know the ways in which that's being done. And what that has done is it has put pressure on the tech community to create user-friendly and easily usable encryption programs so that people can start protecting their own privacy by using encryption. And more people are using it, and more people will continue to use it as it becomes the default means for how we communicate on the internet. That is a serious impediment to the ability of these states to spy on what people are doing on the internet. So you're right that there won't be any bills passed by the US government that severely restrict its own power. Governments don't usually go around thinking about how to limit their own power. They'll do exactly what you correctly said they'll likely do, which is pass something called reform that's really just about symbolically placating public anger. But I think the pressure points are going to come from consumers and users and individuals around the world who are in various ways demanding protection of their own privacy.
Now, you write that a surveillance state is all about accumulating more and more power by being able to know everything about those over whom they are ruling, while those over whom they are ruling know virtually nothing about them. Can you paint a picture of what the evolution of this type of Orwellian surveillance state will look like over the next 10 or 20 years? Where are we headed?
I think that's very much an open question. The reason that I was so committed to doing this reporting is because I think we are at a crossroads where we can decide collectively whether the internet will be this kind of tool of liberalization and democratization that it was heralded as being from the beginning, or whether we'll allow it to be turned into its exact opposite, which is the most oppressive means of social control and monitoring the world has ever known. And I don't know what the outcome of that will be. That a lot of that depends on what we as individuals do by ourselves, but also together to fight for internet freedom. But what I do know is that the institutional goals of the NSA and its four surveillance partners is not to monitor the communication of terrorists or to bolster national security. The institutional goal of the NSA is captured by their own documents, which I've published in my book and elsewhere, that is encapsulated by the model, collect it all. They literally want to convert the internet into a means of ubiquitous surveillance where every single human communication event electronically is monitored and stored and collected by them, which is another way of saying they want to eliminate privacy in the digital age. And whether we allow that to happen will determine the outcome of the question you asked.
Continuing on the topic of media, you recently launched The Intercept, a media outlet which is part of First Look Media, a new company financed by eBay billionaire Piero Midyar. What do you see as the key failings of the mainstream media, and what do you plan to do differently with The Intercept?
If I were to tell you about all of the key failings of the media, we would definitely miss the event that I'm here to do, and then we would probably be into the early hours of the morning. So I'll just give you the two of the primary ones. One is that I think that large media outlets are far too deferential and allied with the very forms of political and economic power, which I think that journalism was designed to check and limit and be adversarial to, not subservient to. The most famous example of which is, what U.S. media outlets did in the Iraq War, where they replicated and amplified and uncritically disseminated the false claims of the U.S. government rather than investigating and scrutinizing them. But I don't think very much has changed in that regard. I think journalists at establishment outlets see themselves as allies of the U.S. government rather than as adversaries, and that's definitely something we want to change. The other aspect is about how individual journalists are trained to think about their role. If you go to work for the New York Times or the Washington Post or the CBC, there are all these rules about how you're allowed to talk about the world. Journalists do this, but they don't do this. Journalists don't express opinions. They don't really make declarative statements about who's right and wrong. They don't have desired political outcomes. They're just sort of these beacons of opinionless neutrality. And to me, this is not just a really boring form of journalism, but it's actually a really neutered form of journalism. If you are going to submit yourself to this extraordinary array of constraint designed to drain the vibrancy and the soul out of journalism, you're going to make yourself completely useless. And we definitely want to create an environment in which journalists are not only encouraged but required to find their own voices, to follow their passion, and to be very upfront and honest about the things they think and work for, and then have their reporting follow from that.